Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with John Turner. He's the author of Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. It's a fantastic new biography of the prophet Joseph, and I'm going to be giving away a free copy. Go to gospeltangents.com/copy, contests rather, gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win an autographed copy of this book right here. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the golden plates, and also, did Joseph take advantage of Martin Harris? We'll also talk about what John calls the audacity of the Book of Mormon. So I thought John had some really interesting comments you won't want to miss. Check it out. Let's move on to the gold plates. Dan Vogel says they were probably made of tin. I remember it seemed like you had 3 or 4 different explanations for how those came through. You don't believe that there were, or I don't know. Tell us what you think. What was the artifact that Joseph used to say he had gold plates?
So I think plates are a little bit of a different matter than visions,
Okay.
right? I mean, visions, when it comes down to it, as I said, we can't penetrate inside somebody else's head. We can't see and hear what Joseph heard and saw. We simply have his narrative accounts. And plates are another matter, right? Plates are a material object. It's a different sort of claim. It's something physical, tangible. It's certainly the case that as a historian, I could have just said, this is what Joseph reported. We could understand it as a visionary experience. Maybe, did or didn't have plates. I don't really want to weigh in. It's a religious matter. But I thought in this case, I should give my best judgment, which is that Joseph didn't have golden plates and that he did engage in a certain amount of subterfuge and deception. He put some sort of object in a box that he hefted around, also placed that under a linen cloth at times. So he certainly had some sort of physical object. I think I don't think they were golden plates. I do think that Joseph made that up. I think he was in a situation in which he had failed to find and retrieve other buried treasures. He needed a new direction for his life in 1827. He both needed an economic direction and had a religious and ecclesiastical vision. The story of the plates and then the Book of Mormon translation become the vehicles for that going forward. And, people ask me about my opinion on the golden plates. It's not surprising, first of all, that a non-Latter-day Saint doesn't think Joseph actually had golden plates. I don't think it's a laughable or preposterous story. As a Protestant Christian, I believe in a set of supernatural claims. I'm sort of open to crazy, miraculous, supernatural things. But in this case, the simplest explanation for me is that a young man who says he has a valuable object, he can't show it to anybody else. The simplest explanation is that he doesn't have it. One part of my own thinking about the plates also pertains to my reading of the Book of Mormon as a 19th century text. And since I've concluded that it's a 19th century text rather than an ancient record, for a 19th century text, one doesn't need golden plates. And it makes it more likely to me that it's a text that flows out of Joseph's literary imagination. And, I recognize that for faithful Latter-day Saints, this is sort of treading on sacred ground. And I don't do that to be disrespectful or rude or mean. At the same time, I think if we're going to take a tradition seriously, and I take the Latter-day Saint tradition seriously as an object of study and respect, if we're going to take a tradition seriously, we have to take it seriously enough to critically examine it. And so I think that's what I've done. And, I simply give my best judgment.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, can you weigh in on Dan Vogel's belief that they were made out of tin?
So there are, so he and other scholars have proposed alternative um, objects or alternative explanations for what Joseph might have had. I don't think there's enough evidence to support any alternative theory.
So there's not enough evidence for Dan's theory. Is that what you're saying?
That's my opinion.
Okay.
Um, Sonia Hazard, another scholar of religion whom I admire, she has a theory that Joseph encountered printing plates and that was an inspiration for the whole project. And he could have had printing plates in the box. But again, I don't think these are suggestive possibilities, but we can't know. So I think we have to leave it as a bit of a mystery.
But there was some sort of an artifact that he covered up.
Yes. I mean, there's definitely a material object. There's something heavy in the box. And then Emma and I think others witnessed to an object that seemed like thin sheets of metal under a linen cloth. So, I mean, I think some sort of metallic object, that's not an unreasonable suggestion. But given the lack of evidence, I think we just have to say we can't know. For some, I think for some faithful Latter-day Saints, the absence of evidence for any alternative explanation is evidence for the faithful account. I don't think that's the case. I don't think the absence of evidence for alternatives is evidence that there were golden plates. But I don't think there is strong evidence for any particular alternative.
I know that Richard Bushman just came out with a new book, which I haven't read, on the golden plates. Was that out in time for you with your book?
No, it was. It's a
Okay.
great book. It's not a defense of the materiality of the plates. Instead, it's a cultural history of what it meant to Latter-day Saints, Joseph's detractors, and others. What the idea of the golden plates has meant to people over time,
Okay.
and how
So not really
they've
relevant
approached
to
it.
your book.
It wasn't directly relevant, but I always learn from anything that Richard Bushman writes.
For sure, for sure. As we move into the start of the church there, it did catch my attention that you mentioned the 1831 possible polygamy revelation with the Native Americans, but I wasn't clear if it's a late account, but and you said, I believe it was Ezra Booth, if I remember right, that he became a critic later, and he didn't say, "Oh, this means there's polygamy." Can you talk about that issue as early as 1831?
Sure. Um, well, before I do that, Rick, will you permit me to say one other thing about the Book of Mormon
Oh,
and the
for sure.
plates?
Absolutely.
So, if listeners are hearing that I don't think Joseph had golden plates, they might think, well, I see Joseph Smith as a fraud, as
Oh,
a deceiver, as an imposter.
pious fraud, that's
Yeah. And that's not my takeaway from the Book of Mormon project. Like,
Okay.
yes, there's an element of subterfuge that gets it off the ground. What strikes me about the project is how utterly unlikely it was that Joseph Smith, who's 21 years old in the fall of 1827, embarks on this project and ends up publishing this 600 or so page book,
Longer than yours.
longer than mine. Um, I think mine is a little faster paced.
It is, for sure.
I mean, this is a really unlikely literary success, right? I mean, it's not a bestseller at the time, but it's done pretty well in
got
the
some
years
legs.
since. It had serious legs. I see this not as primarily an act of deception,
That's interesting.
but as an act of audacity. I mean, it's really a harebrained scheme. And Joseph pulls it off. And I think that's utterly remarkable.
It's like Star Trek. It wasn't that popular until later.
Yeah, well, maybe so. But just getting to the point of having that book published, if a random 21-year-old who doesn't have formal education decides, I'm going to publish this hefty book, what are the odds of getting that book to market? They're really slim. And I think Joseph pulls off something pretty incredible. So I don't see this as, primarily condemning Joseph Smith for not having golden plates, but I see this as crediting him with this literary production.
Well, it does bring up the question then. So it sounds like you're kind of against the pious fraud theory?
Well, I do think, yeah, so I think there's an element of deception, and do think Joseph has a religious vision, but I wouldn't phrase it that way, partly because I try to avoid, for the most part, weighing in on Joseph's sincerity at any given
Well,
moment.
that was my question,
Right.
is he sincere? Would you view him as
Sincere in what sense?
I guess a sincere seeker, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think Joseph was a sincere Christian in the sense of, like his family, um, had been seeking a context in which to encounter, to know, and be saved by Jesus Christ. I think that had been true in the family for quite some time. Joseph knows the Bible. I think he prays sincerely when he's seeking in 1820 or thereabouts. But I think for the most part, it's pretty hard for us to assess sincerity. It's not that easy for us to assess the sincerity of people we encounter in the flesh, right?
Mhm.
People often let us down.
Mhm.
We think somebody's trustworthy and then we get disappointed. That happens all the time. And one thing I try to avoid doing in my biography is weighing in on, is this revelation? Does Joseph sincerely think he's got this message from God? Or does he know he's simply promulgating his own directive? Usually we can't know. And I think as a historian, we can't. I didn't feel like I could go through Joseph's life and with great confidence um, give him a sincerity rating every step of the way. Um, no, I think Joseph believes in the vision that the Book of Mormon and his other texts articulate.
Okay, because I'm glad you stopped me there because we could spend a lot of time here. Martin Harris basically mortgaged a farm, and I remember reading in there, did that because Joseph had a revelation that Martin should give him all the money, $3,000, and so Martin mortgaged the farm, lost his farm. Was that a self-serving revelation for Joseph? Was that a sincere? And I don't know if you wanna weigh in on the Canadian copyright because that's
Yeah.
kind of interesting too.
Well, I want to get to your polygamy question.
Well, we'll get there for sure.
But
We didn't spend a lot of time there.
couple of things I'd say about Joseph and Martin Harris. Harris is desperate to believe in the golden plates and in Joseph Smith. He is looking for a new direction in his life as of fall of 1827. So he's very primed to believe. And I think in the end, Harris doesn't think that Joseph has deceived him or swindled him. He feels that um, he's gotten what he was looking for in Joseph Smith and the church. I I do find it troubling some of the ways that Joseph treats Martin. It would have been very difficult for Joseph to pull off the Book of Mormon project without Martin Harris. I do think he applies ecclesiastical pressure to get a wavering Martin Harris sort of over the line to bankroll or guarantee the book's publication. And then I think as you get into early 1830, Joseph is a little bit, not quite sure what the right word would be, maybe a little bit callous toward Harris, reluctant to split profits from the book sales with him, seems to sort of cut him out of the potential Canadian copyright sale. So I don't generally, I don't know how pointed I am about that in the biography itself, because I try not to go through the biography and, pass judgment on Joseph Smith paragraph by paragraph. But I do think the treatment of Harris in early 1830 is a little bit on the shabby side.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of gathered that a little bit. So, I mean, it's interesting, because they're Lucy and Lucy Harris. Um, I didn't realize she was his first cousin. I knew they were related. I didn't realize it was that close. Um, but she was very against the Book of Mormon and that sort of a thing. So we can dive back into the polygamy now.
Okay. So your question was about whether or not Joseph had an early 1830s revelation,
Yeah.
or I guess revelation, particularly that these elders who have gone out to Missouri on the border with what was then called Indian Territory, whether they could take plural wives from among the natives. And William Phelps has a later account in which he says something along the lines of, Joseph had a revelation on the matter.
And it was kind of related to Martin because
Right.
he was kind of separating from Lucy anyway.
Right. So I don't put too much stock in that. I don't actually think there's solid evidence for Joseph having had a revelation on plural marriage in the 1830s. That does seem to be an accepted position by the church. I see that in a lot of church publications. That could be the case. One thing I argue with respect to that particular moment is that there's a relatively, well, everybody's a new member of the church in 1831, right? But there's a former, I think, Methodist minister named Ezra Booth who's on Joseph's first trip to independence. And Booth becomes disillusioned with Joseph in the church during the trip. And once he returns to Kirtland, he writes a series of scathing letters that are published in a local newspaper. Booth doesn't have any whiff of polygamy, or that Joseph has a plan for the elders to marry native women. And I think had Joseph articulated that on the trip, I certainly think that would have been good fuel for Booth's criticism.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was a very interesting takeaway there. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with John Turner. He's the author of The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, Joseph Smith. We're giving away a free copy. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win an autographed copy right here. In the next conversation, we're going to talk about Fanny Alger and the 1831 polygamy revelation. John has some interesting things to say about that.
I think it's unlikely to have been a plural marriage. It's most likely to have been some sort of brief, intimate relationship I'm not going to speculate more on the precise nature of it.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.